I've been wanting to do a process video for one of my pet portraits for a very long time, and finally everything has sort of come together. So this is my very first video that sort of shows you how I go through drawing a portrait for any extended period of time. A few things to sort of know: this is my very first video doing this sort of thing, so there are some errors. Sometimes I tried to press record on my phone and thought I did and ended up not recording. So there are gaps, and unfortunately I didn't get the last bit of the portrait, but for a good chunk of this portrait, this video will take you through kind of how I move through the stages of doing a pet portrait. So we're going to be looking at how I drew these two cats for a Christmas commission. They are done in colored pencil using Faber-Castell Polychromos, and they are done on Strathmore Bristol vellum. So those are the materials I used, and I will kind of talk you through the different stages of the portrait as we go through. So starting off, I didn't get the first part of the portrait filmed, but this is the very first layer of the drawing. You can tell I'm using a grid method, so each little square is an inch of drawing space. And I don't always use a grid, but when I do pet portraits, I tend to, because I find it really helps with accuracy, and accuracy is what most pet owners are looking for when they commission a portrait from me. So I often use a grid just to help make sure I really get that pet right for the client. So when I'm doing a first layer, I'm not particularly concerned about getting rich, deep colors or whether I have the exact details. Oftentimes you'll see that the strokes I'm using are pretty loose. There's a lot of white showing through from the paper, and the strokes tend to be fairly broad, and I don't often have the sharpest pencils, and I know different artists work differently on portraits, but I like to put down kind of a base sketch in color, is what I would call it. And I go through with kind of the basic colors that I use for the portrait and really get the shape and the general shading down, and that guides me later. I like to do this when I use a grid method because I find it means I can get the basic shapes down, which is what the grid really helps with, before I then go back and add in color and detail and texture, and that way I don't have to rely on the grid so much at that point. So I'm just finishing up the first layer, and then I'm going to go back and start in the left hand side again and add in the second layer, which I think of them in single layers, but in reality there's many more layers built into each of these processes. Usually I have 2 or 3 times that I go over a drawing as a whole before it's complete, so this is the second kind of going through. This is where I do a lot of burnishing, and I try and add in really deep color and get it so that the white paper isn't showing through quite so much. This is where, I start off with what I call my base color, which for each part of the animal and every drawing is going to be different. This was a fairly uniform drawing for most of it. Most of it was just orange. So the base color I had was a cream, which was a bit of a orangey off-white, which you can see is that pencil there. And so going through with the cream, what I do is I burnish it, which means kind of pushing pretty hard on the paper and making a base. And then I would go in and add the more orange textures, the deeper browns. And this is where you really want to have your pencils nice and sharp, because that'll go through the texture of the paper and get those really nice hair textures. This is where direction of stroke is really important. I mean, I try and do that in the first layer as well, at least get the stroke direction right, but this is where you want to take the time. This is the big time consuming part of the drawing as you can tell, progress is a lot slower while I'm going through because I am adding in the majority of the details in this layer. I usually go over the drawing a third time at the end to add in the really fine details like whiskers and ear hairs and make sure the color is completely right. But the second layer is where the bulk of the drawing is done. Yeah, so for most of this drawing I use the cream, again this pencil, and then for the white of the faces that I used the white as the base and then added some grays and light oranges in there as well. And I'm still in a way going grid piece by grid piece, but you can tell there's parts of it where I'm sort of just going with sections of fur rather than focusing exactly on the grid, because again I have that base sketch, which means I can do this bit and this bit without needing to be so reliant on the grid. unfortunately I didn't record any more than this while I was working on this portrait, and because it's a colored pencil portrait, I can't really go back and redo that part. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed kind of looking into the process of how I go through working on a portrait, and thanks so much.